Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always. What are we tackling today?
Today, we're going deep on Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
Ah, a classic.
And here's the twist, we're focusing on winning without even fighting.
Now that's an interesting angle. Winning without fighting. How is that even possible?
Right. That's what I thought. But that's what Sun Tzu is all about. We've got tons of YouTube videos breaking down his ideas, plus some historical examples to see how this all played out in the real world.
We're going to see how this strategy is considered the peak of generalship, not just in ancient China, but across history.
I'm hooked already. But hold on, isn't The Art of War all about, well, war? How can you win without actually fighting?
That's where Sun Tzu gets really interesting. See, he wasn't about glorifying violence. He saw war as a last resort. His goal: achieve the best outcome with the least amount of destruction.
So winning at any cost wasn't the point.
Exactly. And one of his most famous quotes sums it up perfectly. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting.
Okay, breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. That sounds kind of like a Jedi mind trick, you know?
Think of it more as strategic maneuvering, psychological warfare even. You're outsmarting your opponent, making them submit before a battle even begins.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. But do we have any historical examples of this actually working?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look at Cyrus the Great. He founded the Achaemenid Empire. He's a prime example of achieving victory through careful planning and manipulation.
Yeah, Cyrus, he conquered Babylon, right?
You got it.
Didn't he, divert a river to sneak into the city?
That's one version of the story, yeah. But what's often overlooked is the groundwork he laid before any military action even took place.
Okay, so what did he do?
He didn't just rely on clever tactics. He used intelligence to understand the Babylonian people, their unrest. Then he leveraged it. Brilliantly.
He was turning the people against their own leader.
In a way, yes. Cyrus spread propaganda that resonated with the Babylonians, promised them religious tolerance, fairer governance, things they felt they lacked under their current king.
Smart move. Appeal to what people actually want.
Exactly. He even went as far as getting the support of the priests and the aristocracy.
Wow, so he had all the power players on his side.
And it worked. When Cyrus's forces arrived, they met little resistance. Some accounts even suggest he was welcomed as a liberator, not a conqueror.
That's incredible. Conquering a city by winning hearts and minds. Not just territory. That's Sun Tzu's philosophy in action.
It really is. And it highlights a stark contrast with leaders who rely solely on brute force, like, say, Richard the Lionheart.
Oh, yeah, Richard the Lionheart. He was a Crusader king, wasn't he?
He was. And his invasion of Cyprus in 1191 is a perfect example of how excessive violence can backfire, even if you win the initial battle.
So Richard, he was on his way to the Holy Land, needed a base of operations, decided to take over Cyprus. I remember reading about this. It seemed like an easy win at first.
It did, didn't it?
So what went wrong?
Well, Richard's downfall was his impatience and the, brutality of his forces.
So even though he won, he kind of messed things up.
Instead of consolidating his control, building alliances after his victory, he allowed widespread looting and violence.
So even though he won the battle, he created a bunch of new problems.
Exactly. The Cypriot people, understandably, became resentful, made it much harder for Richard to govern the island or use it effectively.
Wow, his actions basically made things worse for him.
His actions even damaged his reputation with potential allies. They saw his behavior as, barbaric.
So his victory in Cyprus actually weakened his overall position.
It certainly did. It's a classic case of how focusing only on brute force can lead to strategic failure.
Makes you think, would Richard have been more successful if he had studied Sun Tzu?
It's a question historians still debate. But it definitely shows winning a battle isn't the same as achieving strategic success. It's about the long game.
Okay, so we've seen the power of winning without combat and the dangers of impatience and brute force. But how do we actually apply Sun Tzu's wisdom practically? Where do we even start?
A crucial starting point is understanding the value of strategy and preparation.
Okay, strategy and preparation. Makes sense.
Sun Tzu constantly warns against acting impulsively.
Yeah, be patient. Easier said than done, right? Put yourself in a leader's shoes, under pressure, with a crisis looming. Why is that the worst time to rush into action?
Because when you're impatient, you're more likely to underestimate your opponent, misjudge the situation, and make decisions based on emotion, not logic.
So you're saying that feeling of we have to do something right now, that could actually be your biggest enemy?
Precisely. Impatience leads to poor planning, unnecessary risks, and ultimately devastating losses. Take, for example, the First Crusade,
The First Crusade, okay.
specifically the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099.
I remember reading about this. The Crusaders were driven by, well, religious fervor, so they were pushing to take the city quickly.
Yes, and that intensity, while understandable, led to some critical blunders. They weren't prepared for a long siege, lacked essential equipment and supplies. Their initial assaults, poorly planned, resulted in heavy casualties.
So they basically just threw themselves at the city walls.
Basically, made their victory much harder and costlier than it needed to be.
Ouch. A harsh reminder that strategy and preparation are vital, even when you believe you're fighting for a righteous cause.
Absolutely. Sun Tzu gives us a framework for thinking strategically about conflict, no matter the circumstances. And one key part of this framework, understanding his rules of engagement.
Hold on. Rules of engagement. That sounds very structured for someone who's all about adapting to the situation.
But that's the beauty of Sun Tzu. He offers guidelines for thinking, not rigid rules. He understood that every situation is different. His rules are more like principles, to be adapted to the specific circumstances.
Okay, so what are these rules of engagement?
They're based on numerical advantage. Think of them as like if-then statements for approaching conflict.
If-then statements. I like that.
For example, if your army is 10 times larger than the enemy's, Sun Tzu advises encirclement, cut off their escape routes, force a swift surrender.
So overwhelming force, but the goal is a quick end to the fighting. Minimize casualties on both sides.
Exactly. Now, if you have 5 times the enemy's forces, Sun Tzu recommends a direct attack.
Okay, so you're still going in strong.
You still have a big advantage, but you need to be more aggressive.
Got it. But what about when the armies are roughly the same size? That's when things get tricky, right?
In that scenario, battle is a possibility, but it's got to be approached carefully, with meticulous planning.
So you can't just charge in blindly, no matter how brave your warriors are.
Bravery without strategy is just reckless. Now imagine you're facing a slightly larger enemy force. Sun Tzu advises against direct confrontation here.
So what do? Wave the white flag and surrender?
Not necessarily. The key is to avoid a decisive battle until you can shift the advantage in your favor.
I see. So you're biding your time, looking for an opportunity.
Exactly. Look for ways to weaken the enemy, disrupt their plans, or create a more favorable situation for yourself.
So it's about patience.
Patience and choosing your battles wisely.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when you're totally outnumbered? Any chance of winning then?
When the odds are stacked against you, retreat is often the wisest option.
Live to fight another day, as they say.
Exactly. Sun Tzu understood that clinging to a hopeless situation only leads to more losses.
So even retreating can be a strategic victory if it ensures your survival.
Absolutely. It all comes back to adapting to the situation, making calculated decisions, and remembering the ultimate goal, achieving your objectives, not just winning individual battles.
Okay, I'm getting it. But I'd love to see how these rules of engagement play out in real-life situations. Do you have any examples?
Well, there's the fascinating case of Bernard Montgomery at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Montgomery, brilliant strategist. He was up against Rommel, the Desert Fox. But he didn't just throw his larger army at the enemy. No. He used his numbers intelligently.
Yeah, Montgomery had, what, like twice as many troops as Rommel? What did he do?
He split his forces, launched multiple attacks against different parts of the German lines.
He was keeping them guessing.
This, straight out of Sun Tzu's playbook, for an army twice the size of its opponent.
So while some British units were engaged in a head-on fight, others were maneuvering around the flanks, keeping Rommel guessing.
Exactly. The Germans were stretched thin, and Montgomery's careful planning led to a decisive Allied victory.
A turning point in the North African campaign, proof that strategic thinking, adapting to the circumstances, is powerful stuff.
Absolutely. And for a completely different scenario, let's rewind the clock. Way back to 1066. King Harold Godwinson of England facing a Viking invasion.
1066, okay, that's right before the Norman conquest.
Led by Harold Hardrada.
Yeah, didn't Harold have a tough situation on his hands, facing two enemies at once?
He did. The Vikings were a serious threat. But Harold, he knew he couldn't afford a long, drawn-out fight with them.
Because William the Conqueror was waiting in the wings, ready to invade from Normandy.
Exactly. Talk about pressure.
Yeah.
Harold had to deal with Hardrada, and quickly, decisively.
But I thought the Viking army was pretty big. Weren't they a match for the English?
The forces were pretty evenly matched, numbers-wise anyway. But Sun Tzu emphasizes choosing the time and place of battle.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did Harold do?
He didn't wait for Hardrada to get organized.
Yeah.
He marched his army north, fast, and surprised the Vikings at Stamford Bridge.
A classic surprise attack, straight out of Sun Tzu.
And it worked like a charm. The Vikings caught completely off guard. They weren't in formation. They were unprepared. The English routed them.
Wow, what a move. But, as you mentioned, Harold had another enemy to worry about.
Sadly, yes. Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge, short-lived. Just a few weeks later, he faced William at Hastings. And, well, let's just say it didn't end so well for him.
That's a story for another deep dive, I guess.
It is.
But Stamford Bridge shows us how speed, surprise, exploiting your enemy's weaknesses are all key to Sun Tzu's thinking.
Definitely. And for our final historical example, let's switch gears completely. Let's look at George Washington during the American Revolution.
Now that's what I call a David versus Goliath situation.
It was.
The Continental Army totally outmatched by the British Empire. How did Washington even stand a chance?
That's where Sun Tzu's principles become even more crucial. Washington knew he couldn't win a direct confrontation. Not a chance. So he played the long game.
The long game.
He adopted a strategy of, well, strategic retreats and hit-and-run tactics.
He was avoiding giving the British the big, decisive battle they wanted.
Exactly. Washington understood to win, he had to wear the British down. Over time,
Smart.
he used the terrain to his advantage, harassed their supply lines, and he struck when the opportunity was right. But always avoided a full-on engagement.
Guerrilla warfare.
Right.
That must have been so frustrating for the British.
So it was. And while the war was long, grueling, Washington's patience, his attrition strategy, paid off in the end.
Incredible to see how these ancient principles could be applied so effectively centuries later in a completely different kind of war.
It speaks to the timeless wisdom of Sun Tzu. But there's one more crucial element we haven't discussed. Deception.
Yes. Making your enemies see what you want them to see. I'm all ears. Sun Tzu talks about making the unreal appear real, making your opponent move where you want them to go. How does that actually work?
Deception, it takes many forms. Could be feints on a battlefield, spreading misinformation, or disguising your true intentions. It's about crafting a narrative, one that benefits you.
So you're leading your enemy down the wrong path.
You're leading them to react in a way that plays into your hands.
Okay, I can see that. But do we have any examples of this kind of deception actually being used effectively?
One of the most famous examples is the D-Day invasion. The Allies went to incredible lengths to deceive the Germans about the landing location.
Oh, I've always been fascinated by this. What did they do?
They created a phantom army, inflatable tanks, aircraft, fake radio chatter, even double agents feeding false information to the German high command.
Wow.
They wanted the Germans to think the invasion was coming at Pas de Calais, not Normandy.
So while the real landings were happening in Normandy, the Germans were focused hundreds of miles away. Genius.
It worked. The deception bought the Allies valuable time to establish a beachhead before the Germans realized what was happening.
It was a key factor in the success of D-Day.
It was. But deception isn't the only tool in the box. Sun Tzu also talks about adaptability. Like water, he says, warfare has no constant form. What does that mean strategically?
So it's not about having a perfect plan, it's about being flexible.
A successful general, or any leader for that matter, must be able to adjust their plans as the situation changes. Rigidity leads to failure. Flexibility allows you to seize opportunities as they arise.
So you have to think on your feet.
Exactly. And a great example of this, the Taliban's use of guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan. They were facing a far superior force, the U.S. military. Yet they managed to resist for years.
How did they pull that off?
By constantly adapting. They used the terrain to their advantage, employed hit-and-run tactics, blended in with the civilian population.
They knew they couldn't win a conventional war.
So they didn't try. They turned their disadvantages into strengths.
Mind-blowing how these principles from the art of war, written so long ago, are still relevant today.
That's the power of Sun Tzu. It's not just a military manual. It's a deep dive into human nature, the dynamics of power, his principles, applicable to all sorts of conflicts, on a battlefield, in a business deal, even in our personal relationships.
Now that's food for thought. So we've covered the historical context and some fascinating examples, but let's bring this back to our listeners. If someone wants to start applying these principles in their own lives, where do they begin?
It all starts with cultivating a mindset of strategic thinking.
Okay, strategic thinking. How do you do that? Do I need to become a chess master or something?
Simpler than that. Start by observing the world around you. Look for the subtle conflicts. They're always happening. even in seemingly peaceful situations. Pay attention to how people interact, the power dynamics, the choices they make.
So we should be looking for the strategies people are using, even in everyday life.
Exactly. Once you start seeing the world through that lens, you can start applying Sun Tzu's principles.
Okay, so I'm observing. What next?
Gather information. Assess your own strengths and weaknesses. Choose your battles carefully. And always be ready to adapt.
It's like we're all playing a giant strategy game. The more we understand the rules, the better we can play.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, victory doesn't always mean crushing your opponent.
Right.
It could mean achieving your goals, resolving a conflict peacefully, even just finding a way to coexist. In a world full of differing opinions, approaches.
So much wisdom packed into the art of war. It's incredible. But there's one aspect we haven't touched on yet, and it's a bit controversial. The idea of manipulation. Sun Tzu advocates using deception, psychological tactics to gain an advantage. Some might say that's just a fancy word for being manipulative, right?
It's a valid concern, and we should definitely address it thoughtfully. There's definitely a fine line between using strategy and resorting to unethical tactics.
So how do we distinguish between Sun Tzu's wisdom and something that crosses the line into manipulation, harmful behavior?
I think the key is remembering Sun Tzu's ultimate goal, to achieve victory with minimal destruction. His philosophy. It's rooted in minimizing harm, not exploiting or hurting others for personal gain.
It's about using strategy to find a solution that benefits everyone involved, not just yourself.
Exactly. And it's about using deception as a way to prevent conflict, not escalate it. Think of it like a negotiation tactic.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine a hostage situation. The negotiator might use deception to gain the trust of the hostage taker, to calm them down, convince them a peaceful resolution is possible.
So in that case, the deception is actually aimed at de-escalating the situation, potentially saving lives.
It's the intention behind the action that matters.
Right. If you're being deceptive to manipulate someone for selfish reasons, that's wrong.
But if you're doing it to prevent harm, find a solution that benefits everyone. It could be a powerful tool for good.
It's about wielding that power responsibly. And that's a lesson that goes beyond battlefields and boardrooms. It's about being mindful of how our actions impact others. Using our strategic skills to build a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. Sun Tzu encourages us to be more thoughtful, more deliberate in our actions, assess the situation, make choices that align with our values and long-term goals.
It's not about becoming some, cold, calculating strategist. It's about being more intentional with how we navigate life's challenges and opportunities.
That's the essence of it. And it's a journey of constant learning, self-discovery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the art of war, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
I'd say it's the understanding that strategy isn't just about winning. It's about thinking deeply about conflict, understanding the motivations of everyone involved, and finding creative solutions that minimize harm, maximize benefit.
So it's not just about conquering your enemies, it's about conquering the challenges we all face in life.
You got it. That's the true art of conquering, not just on the battlefield, but in all aspects of life.
Amazing. Well, folks, keep those strategic minds sharp. We'll be back soon for another deep dive into something fascinating. You know, it's amazing we've been discussing the art of war as this ancient text, but it feels so relevant to our modern world.
It really does, doesn't it? What I find fascinating is how Sun Tzu's principles, they apply to so many areas. Politics, business, even personal relationships.
It's true, he understood something fundamental about human nature and how power dynamics work. It makes you think, right? We're constantly bombarded with information these days, everyone trying to get ahead. It's like we're all battling for attention or influence in some way.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at the political landscape today, it often feels like a battleground of ideologies, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
It does, doesn't it?
And social media, well, that's become the new terrain where these battles are fought. It's all about shaping public opinion, controlling the narrative, even influencing how people vote.
I think Sun Tzu would be fascinated by how information warfare has evolved. You know, the principles of deception, propaganda, strategic communication, they're all more relevant than ever in our digital age.
It makes you wonder, are our political leaders secretly studying the art of war to gain an edge?
I wouldn't be surprised. And while we shouldn't be naive about the potential for manipulation, I think understanding these tactics can help us become more discerning, more discerning consumers of information.
So it's about recognizing the strategies being used, not falling prey to emotional manipulation or misinformation, being aware of the game that's being played.
Exactly. And it's about using our own strategic thinking, right? To advocate for the ideas we believe in, to have constructive conversations, to find common ground even when there's disagreement.
Because at the end of the day, Sun Tzu wasn't about creating more conflict, he was about finding ways to resolve it effectively.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? He studied war, not to glorify it, but to understand it deeply, and ultimately to find ways to avoid it whenever possible.
Which brings us to the big question. How can we, as individuals, apply these principles to, live more fulfilling, meaningful lives?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? I think Sun Tzu's wisdom encourages us to be more mindful, more strategic, more deliberate in our actions. It's about taking a step back, assessing the situation, making choices that align with our values and goals.
So it's not about turning into some kind of cold, calculating strategist.
No, not at all.
It's about being more intentional with how we navigate life's challenges and opportunities.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that conflict, well, it's unavoidable, but it doesn't have to rule us. We have the power to choose how we respond, to seek understanding instead of dominance, to find creative solutions that benefit everyone involved.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the art of war, let's leave our listeners with a challenge.
I love that idea. What do you have in mind?
Over the next week, I challenge everyone listening to pay attention. Pay attention to the conflicts you encounter, big or small. Notice the dynamics, the strategies being used, how you naturally react.
Yeah. And ask yourself, how could you apply Sun Tzu's principles to handle these situations differently, maybe even better? Can you find a way to de-escalate, find common ground, achieve a more positive outcome for everyone?
It's an invitation to become more aware, more strategic, and ultimately more masterful in the art of living.
And you might just surprise yourself, conquer some challenges you thought were impossible.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.